There's a strange silence spreading among men. It's not loud enough to notice at first. Not the kind of silence that echoes after heartbreak, but the kind that creeps in before it ever happens. It's a quiet resignation that sits behind polite smiles, half-hearted dating app swipes, and eyes that have stopped looking for something real. You can feel it in the way conversations drift away from love, replaced by jokes about staying single, peace over drama, or focusing on myself. But beneath the humor lies a deeper confession. Modern men are silently giving up on love, not because they no longer desire it, but because they no longer believe it's possible without losing themselves. Imagine a man, let's call him Daniel. He's not bitter, not broken. He has a decent job, a social circle, even a few stories of what could have been. Yet something in him has gone dim. He's learned that every romantic pursuit now carries a quiet risk of rejection, misunderstanding, performance, or moral judgment. He's tired of being both the actor and the audience in a theater where sincerity feels out of place. He scrolls through endless faces online, feeling the growing absurdity of trying to find meaning in a system designed for convenience. He wants connection but fears entanglement. He wants intimacy but dreads exposure. What Daniel feels, this unspoken fatigue, is not new, though its modern form is sharper, more suffocating. Søren Kierkegaard once wrote, "The greatest hazard of all, losing oneself, can occur very quietly in the world, as if it were nothing at all." And perhaps this is what's happening now. Not merely to Daniel, but to millions of men across the world. They are not losing themselves in passion. They are losing themselves in withdrawal. The tragedy is subtle. Love has become something that must justify itself in advance. Men are told to be emotionally available but not too needy, confident but not controlling, vulnerable but not weak. Each quality that once defined sincerity has been rebranded as a potential liability. So men learn to perform safety instead of authenticity. They learn to filter every impulse through an invisible tribunal. Will this make me look desperate? Will this be used against me later? Am I being too much too soon? Slowly, the spontaneous act of loving becomes a psychological minefield. Yet this retreat isn't driven only by fear of rejection or heartbreak. It's also a reaction to the loss of philosophical grounding. For centuries, love carried an existential weight. It was an encounter with the other that revealed the self. But in a world where the self is now fragmented into profiles, preferences, and projections, love no longer feels like revelation. It feels like negotiation. Men are caught between craving transcendence and fearing vulnerability, between the need to feel something real and the pressure to remain untouchable. What emerges from this conflict is a quiet despair disguised as indifference. Men tell themselves they're fine without love. They build routines of solitude and call it freedom. They convince themselves that emotional detachment is wisdom, that caring less means hurting less. But under that logic, something vital erodes. The capacity for awe, for surrender, for the irrational beauty of devotion. This isn't about nostalgia for an idealized past or a critique of modern relationships. It's about a deeper existential fracture, the dissonance between the human need for meaning and the modern world's insistence on optimization. When love becomes a market, the soul becomes a product. When everything is filtered through efficiency, tenderness feels inefficient, even dangerous. And so men quietly drift away, not in rebellion, but in exhaustion. They stop searching not because they have found peace, but because peace now seems more attainable in solitude than in connection. The silence that follows is deceptive. Sounds like strength, but it's often resignation. Yet beneath that silence lies a question waiting to surface. Not why don't men love anymore, but what has love become that it no longer calls them? The answer to that question begins where philosophy meets loneliness, where Kierkegaard's haunting insight into despair collides with the digital age's emotional architecture. If you were to stand in front of a mirror today and ask yourself who you are without your roles, without your phone, without the algorithms that remind you what you like, could you answer? Most modern men cannot. The mirror reflects not one coherent identity, but a collage of fragments. Professional image, social mask, digital avatar, emotional residue. The self has become a network rather than a being. And when love calls to such a fragmented man, it echoes off the hollow walls of confusion. Kierkegaard once described despair not as sadness, but as the sickness unto death, a condition of being alienated from oneself. It is not the pain of loss, but the pain of not knowing who is even doing the losing. In the modern world, despair has taken a subtler form. It hides beneath competence, ambition, and curated confidence. Men appear functional, successful even, but internally they are divided between the man they present and the man they truly are. The result is not merely loneliness but estrangement from the very capacity to love. Because love, at its root, demands the presence of a self, someone stable enough to give, someone coherent enough to be known. Yet, in a world where attention is currency, identity becomes performance. Every relationship becomes a mirror reflecting expectations rather than essence. The man who tries to love through this mirror finds his reflection distorted, blurred by comparison and fear of inadequacy. He feels that to be loved, he must be optimized, emotionally fluent yet stoic, confident yet sensitive, ambitious yet humble. Each demand fractures him further, until love itself begins to feel like an exam with no correct answers. Social media intensifies this fragmentation. The platforms that promise connection instead engineer performance. Men scroll through endless portrayals of idealized intimacy, filtered vacations, choreographed affection, aesthetic vulnerability. Love becomes another content genre. Authentic emotion feels outdated, replaced by curated sincerity. And so men learn to measure connection by visibility. If no one sees it, does it even exist? The private space of affection collapses into public proof, and what was once sacred becomes data. Kierkegaard's mirror warns of precisely this. When the self depends on reflection, it loses depth. Modern men are surrounded by mirrors, digital, cultural, psychological, and yet cannot find the stillness to see their own face. They date not to encounter another soul, but to verify that they still exist. But how can one offer love when one's own existence feels contingent on external validation? This is why so many men retreat into abstraction, intellectualizing emotion, discussing love as theory rather than living it as risk. It feels safer to analyze than to feel, to understand than to surrender. But this safety carries a quiet corrosion. The heart, denied its own language, begins to atrophy. Connection without vulnerability becomes sterile, and soon even pleasure feels mechanical. In private, the despair surfaces differently. Some men bury it under work, others under distractions, others under cynicism. They tell themselves that love is unnecessary, that freedom lies in detachment. But what they're really rejecting is not love itself. It's the unbearable confrontation with their own dividedness. To love would mean to be seen, and to be seen would mean admitting how disassembled they've become. This is the paradox Kierkegaard understood so well, that the self must first be found before it can be given away. Modern men skip this step. They move from one connection to another, seeking completion in external affirmation, never realizing that love cannot fill a void that refuses to reveal its shape. In trying to escape despair, they only deepen it. And so, connection multiplies even as intimacy fades. Men are everywhere present yet internally absent, networked but unseen. Their silence about love is not indifference but a symptom of despair turned inward. It's a quiet acknowledgement that to risk intimacy now feels like walking into battle without armor. But the truth is more haunting. The armor itself is what's killing them. The more layers they add to protect the self, the less self remains to love. In the next section, this despair will meet its opposite, the longing for transcendence. Because even in retreat, even behind walls of detachment, something in men still hungers for the sacred experience of being truly known. The most painful state of being is remembering the future, particularly the one you'll never have. Søren Kierkegaard. There was once a time when love was not merely an emotion but an event, something that ruptured the soul, that pulled two people out of ordinary existence and made them participants in something sacred. Carried weight. It was the thread that tied meaning to mystery, suffering to joy, self to other. Today, that thread has thinned to almost nothing. Love still exists, yes, but it floats, light, casual, endlessly negotiable. It no longer breaks or binds. It drifts. And men, sensing this loss of gravity, no longer feel compelled to chase what feels so unanchored. This shift is not a failure of romance, but of metaphysics. Kierkegaard believed that love was inseparable from transcendence, that to truly love was to face the eternal in another person. In his words, love believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things, because it touches something infinite. It's not about utility or compatibility, it's about revelation. Love was once the arena in which the soul encountered its own depth. But in the modern world, transcendence has been traded for transaction. Relationships are built on comfort, optimization, and psychological efficiency. The question is no longer, what does love reveal about who I am? But rather, does this relationship fit my lifestyle? What used to be an existential leap has become a logistical calculation. For men, this new landscape feels both liberating and hollow. On the surface, it offers control, the ability to choose partners, to define boundaries, to manage emotional investments. But beneath that control lies a quiet despair. If love no longer calls us beyond ourselves, what purpose does it serve? When everything is reduced to mutual convenience, the soul finds no place to dwell. Consider how modern language treats intimacy. Situationships, chemistry, compatibility, boundaries. These are managerial terms, not sacred ones. They describe systems of balance rather than experiences of awe. The danger of this vocabulary is not its practicality but its shallowness. It keeps us safe from the terror of real connection. Men have learned to navigate emotions with the precision of economists. Give enough to maintain interest, but never enough to risk dependence. Love becomes a contract of emotional efficiency. And yet, deep down, there remains an ache, a hunger for transcendence disguised as boredom. When a man says he's tired of dating, what he often means is that he's tired of pretending love is a game of optimization. He longs for something that breaks through the digital choreography, something that reawakens the awe he's been trained to suppress. But awe demands surrender, and surrender feels dangerous in a world that rewards detachment. Philosopher Byung-Chul Han describes our time as an era of transparency, where everything must be exposed, explained, and consumed. Love, which once thrived in mystery, now suffocates under the demand for openness. In an age that fears silence, vulnerability feels obsolete. Men are taught to perform understanding, to appear emotionally literate, while secretly longing for the ineffable. But love without mystery is like faith without doubt. Mechanical, predictable, dead. When transcendence dies, desire doesn't disappear. It mutates. It becomes restlessness, the endless scrolling, the constant comparisons, the quiet dissatisfaction even in companionship. Modern men, stripped of spiritual vocabulary, chase transcendence through substitutes. Achievement, novelty, freedom. But these are echoes, not answers. Without the sense that love connects us to something beyond ourselves, even passion becomes self-referential, a mirror reflecting only its own emptiness. This is why so many men today experience love as anxiety rather than grace. Every emotion feels provisional, every attachment conditional. The fear of loss has been replaced by something quieter but more corrosive, the fear of insignificance. If everything is replaceable, then no connection truly matters. Love becomes another item in the endless buffet of experiences, consumed and forgotten. And yet, in moments of stillness, a quiet night, an old song, the smell of someone who once mattered, something awakens. A flicker of recognition, a whisper that says, "There was more to this once." That whisper is not nostalgia. It is the memory of transcendence, buried but unextinguished. Kierkegaard wrote, "To cheat oneself out of love is the most terrible deception. It is an eternal loss for which there is no reparation." The modern man may not use such words, but he feels their truth in the hollowness of casual affection and the weightlessness of perpetual options. The next section will turn toward the psychological battlefield, how this spiritual emptiness translates into emotional paralysis, and why even when love appears, modern men no longer know how to receive it. There is a moment in almost every man's life when love knocks gently on the door, not with grand gestures, but with quiet sincerity. It might be the warmth of someone's gaze, the vulnerability of a shared silence, or the subtle recognition that he has been truly seen. And yet, many men flinch. They retreat behind invisible walls, deflect with humor, rationalize their distance, or let the moment dissolve. To outsiders, it looks like fear of commitment. But beneath the surface lies something deeper and more existential, the fear of being known. This fear is not born from arrogance or emotional coldness, but from years of conditioning. From early boyhood, men are taught that love must be earned through performance, that affection is conditional, that emotion is weakness disguised as danger. Every failure, every heartbreak, every moment of humiliation builds a layer of armor. By adulthood, that armor becomes second skin. Functional, admired, even necessary. It allows men to operate, succeed, and protect themselves. But it also suffocates the part of them capable of surrender. Kierkegaard saw this paradox clearly. He described despair as the unwillingness to be oneself. For modern men, the unwillingness is not conscious. It's survival. To be fully oneself, to expose the raw, unfiltered core of desire, fear, and hope, feels unbearable in a culture that prizes control and self-sufficiency. Vulnerability no longer reads as courage. It reads as risk. And so men conceal their inner lives behind irony, intellect, and routine. They become experts at emotional management, knowing just how much to reveal to seem genuine, but never enough to be wounded. They practice connection the way soldiers practice defense, calculating the terrain, anticipating loss, staying just far enough from the blast radius of intimacy. And over time, what begins as protection becomes isolation. This armor has evolved to fit the modern world perfectly. Digital life rewards detachment. Online interactions allow control over perception. One can delete, edit, or retreat at will. Real vulnerability, which thrives on unpredictability, has no place in an environment built for curation. When a man is praised for emotional intelligence today, it often means he knows the vocabulary of feelings, not that he has risked expressing them. He has learned to simulate openness while remaining untouched. But the human soul was not designed for endless self-defense. It begins to ache beneath the armor. Men feel this ache as restlessness, irritability, or a vague sense of unreality. They crave closeness but distrust it. They tell themselves they need space, but the space becomes a void. The paradox deepens. The very armor that protects them from pain also denies them joy. Some men attempt to dismantle this armor through self-improvement or therapy, and yet even there, a subtle trap awaits, the illusion that vulnerability can be mastered. They learn frameworks and language for emotion but rarely surrender to its raw, unmediated chaos. Love, however, does not yield to frameworks. It demands that a man stand defenseless, trembling, unprepared, that he step outside the architecture of self-control. To love is to risk humiliation, to be misread, to be left, and yet, paradoxically, it is also the only way to be free. Without that risk, the self remains trapped in Kierkegaard's infinite reflection, endlessly analyzing but never living. The man who cannot risk being known condemns himself to perpetual observation, like a ghost watching his own life from behind glass. And this is the tragedy. Most modern men are not heartless. They are heart-weary. They want to love but fear what it would cost to be seen without the armor. They want to be chosen, but only if it requires no exposure. They want intimacy, but on the condition that it never truly penetrates. And so they end up inhabiting half-loves, safe, negotiated, emotionally contained. What men forget, and what Kierkegaard understood, is that love's danger is its meaning. To be known and still loved is the closest thing to grace. Without that danger, love becomes sterile, a mirror of ego rather than a bridge to transcendence. When the armor finally cracks, it is rarely dramatic. It happens in silence, in the recognition that safety has become loneliness, that distance has become despair. The man who once swore he needed no one begins to feel the quiet terror of being unseen not by others, but by himself. And from that breaking point, something new begins to stir. The faint, trembling courage to risk again. To walk without armor, even once, is to rediscover what it means to be alive. To love another person is to see the face of God. Fyodor Dostoevsky. In the final section, this fragile courage will meet its conclusion. Not in triumph, but in truth. How modern men might learn to love again, not by rejecting their silence, but by redeeming it. There comes a point when the silence itself begins to speak. Not the silence of avoidance or defeat, but the silence that follows exhaustion. The stillness that arrives when a man has finally stopped running from himself. It is in this stillness that something ancient begins to stir. The longing to live fully again, to feel without calculation, to touch without fear. This is the silence Kierkegaard understood not as emptiness, but as the prelude to rebirth, the place where despair, if endured honestly, becomes the soil of transformation. For modern men, the path back to love does not begin with grand gestures or new ideologies. It begins with learning to inhabit their own silence without turning it into a prison. Silence can either conceal the heart or refine it. The difference lies in courage, the willingness to listen to what the silence has been hiding. Beneath the fatigue, the cynicism, and the endless noise of distraction, there is often something simple but sacred. The faint pulse of the desire to love and be loved without defense. To redeem that silence, a man must first confront the illusion that strength means detachment. The modern world has equated stoicism with emotional neutrality, confusing endurance with absence. But real strength, as Kierkegaard hinted, lies in the leap of faith, the audacity to believe in meaning even when logic says none exists. In love, that leap means choosing vulnerability again. Not because the world has changed, but because one has. The act of loving again in this age is revolutionary not for its romance, but for its defiance. To love sincerely today is to resist an entire culture of irony and distraction. It means valuing presence over performance, depth over validation, and stillness over speed. It means showing up to another person not as a brand, not as a curated self, but as something trembling, unfinished, and real. In a society that prizes polish, rawness is rebellion. But this redemption cannot be abstract. It must be lived. It begins in the smallest gestures, listening without preparing an answer, risking a confession that might not be reciprocated, allowing silence in a conversation without needing to fill it. It means letting tenderness return without shame. Love grows not in perfection but in permission. The permission to be flawed and still worthy of connection. There will still be fear. The armor does not fall away all at once. Some days it will return heavier than before. Some wounds will reopen. Some trust will falter. But healing is not the absence of fear. It is the act of loving through it. To be fully alive is not to escape vulnerability, but to inhabit it gracefully. Every heartbreak endured with honesty, every rejection met with dignity, becomes a quiet form of wisdom. The redemption of love for modern men, then, is not a return to the past or to old ideals. It is an evolution toward authenticity, a love that no longer depends on validation or guarantees. Kierkegaard's insight lingers here. The self is found in the act of giving itself away. To love again, a man must risk that act, not because he expects reward, but because withholding it has cost him too much. And perhaps this is the final paradox. Men do not rediscover love by seeking it. They rediscover it by learning to be present, by standing unguarded in the uncertainty of connection, allowing themselves to be changed by it. Love ceases to be a destination and becomes a practice, a daily discipline of honesty, attention, and surrender. Imagine Daniel again, the man who once drifted in quiet resignation. One day, he does something small but extraordinary. He reaches out without irony. He writes the message, makes the call, or simply looks into someone's eyes without retreat. It is nothing cinematic. It is human, raw, trembling, but it is the beginning of a new life. In that moment, love returns not as comfort but as truth, a truth that burns and heals in equal measure. Kierkegaard once said, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom." To love again Modern men must learn to endure that dizziness, to accept the risk of loss as the price of genuine existence. Freedom without love is emptiness. Love without freedom is bondage. The task is to stand between them, to live, to love, to tremble, and still to choose connection. The silence will remain, but it will no longer be the silence of surrender. It will be the silence of reverence, the quiet that falls when something sacred is finally understood. That even in a fractured, fleeting world, love is still the only thing that makes us whole.